In the rugged Clearwater Valley of Montana Territory in 1887, the town of Millbrook knew how to crush dreams before they could take root. When Maya Thompson arrived on the afternoon stage with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a prayer, the local elite thought they'd found their newest source of entertainment. She was visibly pregnant, alone, and desperate enough to beg for work washing clothes at the lowest wages they could offer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They sent her to the Broken Arrow Ranch, owned by James Morrison, a man they whispered had lost his mind to grief after his wife's death 3 years prior. The townspeople thought pairing a desperate pregnant woman with the territory's most reclusive rancher would provide months of gossip. What they didn't expect was that sometimes broken people fit together in ways that make them stronger than they ever were whole. The September wind carried the scent of changing leaves and distant snow when Maya Thompson stepped down from the Wells Fargo stage at Millbrook Station. Her hand pressed against her lower back where the baby's weight had been testing her endurance for the past 3 months of travel. The other hand clutched the handle of her carpetbag, which contained everything she owned in this world: 2 dresses, her late mother's Bible, a few precious letters from her deceased husband, and exactly $17 in crumpled bills. The wedding ring on her finger caught the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the gathering clouds. It was a simple silver band that had belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, and finally graced her own hand during those precious 2 years of marriage to Daniel. The ring was real, but Maya knew that in this frontier town, a pregnant woman without a visible husband would face the same skepticism she'd encountered in every settlement between here and Ohio. The stage driver, a weathered man named Pete Hawkins who'd spoken maybe 20 words during their 2-day journey from Helena, spat tobacco juice into the dust and gestured toward the collection of wooden buildings that passed for civilization. "This here's Millbrook, ma'am. Population maybe 200 on a good day. Ain't much to look at, but the railroad's coming through next year, so folks are optimistic." Maya surveyed her new home with the practiced eye of a woman who'd learned not to expect much from life. Main Street stretched perhaps 3 blocks, flanked by false-fronted buildings in various states of repair. Bennett's General Store dominated the center of town, its painted sign promising dry goods, provisions, and postal services. Next to it squatted a modest saloon called the Silver Dollar, while across the street a small building bore the faded shingle of Dr. William Hayes, physician and surgeon. At the far end of the street she could see the skeletal framework of what would become the railroad station, its half-finished timbers reaching toward the sky like the bones of some enormous creature. Men moved around the construction site with purpose, their voices carrying across the distance as they called out instructions and warnings. It was the people who truly told the story of Millbrook. Women hurried past with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Children played in the dusty street with the wary alertness of young animals who understood that safety was never guaranteed. Men gathered outside the saloon even at this afternoon hour, their clothes bearing the stains of honest work mixed with the slouch of disappointment. This was a place where hope came tentatively, Maya realized, and perhaps that made it perfect for someone like her who'd learned to rebuild dreams from their ashes. "Where might I inquire about lodging?" she asked Pete, though part of her already dreaded the answer. The driver scratched his grizzled chin and looked uncomfortable, his eyes dropping to her obviously pregnant state. "Well, ma'am, that's a bit of a problem. Ruth Bennett runs the boarding house above her store, but she's particular about her guests. Widow like yourself," he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. "Widow with child," Maya finished for him, having heard similar words in 4 other towns during her journey west. The assumption that she was unwed followed her like a shadow, despite the ring on her finger. Apparently, pregnancy without a visible husband was scandal enough to close doors and harden hearts, regardless of the truth. From the direction of the saloon, she heard rough laughter that held no warmth. Several men had noticed her arrival and were pointing in her direction, their comments too distant to hear clearly, but their intentions obvious enough. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and lifted her chin. She'd faced worse than small-town gossips and survived. "I'll speak with Mrs. Bennett," she said firmly. "Where might I find her establishment?" Pete pointed toward the general store. That's her place there. But ma'am, I don't think you understand. Ruth Bennett's got a reputation for being, he searched for diplomatic words, selective about who she rents to. Especially when it comes to women in your particular circumstances. My circumstances are my own concern, Maya replied with quiet dignity. But I appreciate your honesty. As the stage rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving her standing alone with her single bag, Maya felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes upon her. The men from the saloon had wandered closer, emboldened by curiosity and the entertainment value of a lone woman in obvious need. Their leader was a thin man with pale eyes and a carefully waxed mustache that suggested pretensions above his station. His clothes were clean but not expensive, marking him as someone who worked for others while dreaming of commanding respect. When he spoke, his voice carried the practiced authority of a small man given a small amount of power. Well, well, he drawled, stepping forward with a smile that never reached his eyes. What have we here? A new arrival, and in such an interesting condition. Allow me to introduce myself. Victor Caldwell, assistant to the Territorial Land Commissioner. I handle various business interests in Millbrook. His companions chuckled appreciatively, and Maya noticed how they positioned themselves to cut off her easy retreat toward the general store. She'd seen this dynamic before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 4. In other towns, predators circling what they perceived as easy prey. Mr. Caldwell, she replied politely, but coolly. I'm looking for Mrs. Bennett's establishment. I was told she might have rooms available. Caldwell's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too small for his mouth. Oh, she might indeed. Ruth Bennett's got rooms, that's true enough, but she's particular about her clientele. Doesn't much care for complications, if you understand my meaning. His eyes dropped meaningfully to her belly, and Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not from embarrassment, but from anger at the casual cruelty of men who thought a woman's desperation was their entertainment. How thoughtful of you to concern yourself with Mrs. Bennett's business preferences, Maya replied, her voice carrying just enough edge to make Caldwell's eyes narrow slightly. I'm sure she's capable of speaking for herself. Before Caldwell could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Victor Caldwell, seems to me you've got better things to do than bother travelers. The voice belonged to a man who emerged from the doctor's office with the measured gait of someone whose joints protested every step, but whose spirit remained unbroken. Dr. William Hayes was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a face marked by years of witnessing both suffering and healing. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, and his medical bag hung from one hand like a badge of authority. Doc Hayes, Caldwell said, his tone immediately more respectful but laced with resentment. Just being neighborly, that's all, welcoming our new arrival to town. Your kind of neighborly tends to leave folks worse off than when you started, Dr. Hayes replied dryly. He turned to Maya with a slight bow that belonged to an earlier, more courteous era. Ma'am, I'm Dr. William Hayes. Welcome to our community, such as it is. Maya Thompson, she replied gratefully, recognizing a genuine ally when she saw one. I was hoping to find lodging and perhaps employment. Dr. Hayes glanced at Caldwell and his cronies, who were still hovering nearby like vultures waiting for carrion. Boys, don't you have somewhere else to be? Last I heard, the railroad crew was looking for extra hands to help with the station foundation. Caldwell's face darkened, but he gestured to his companions with obvious reluctance. Come on, fellas. Let's leave the good doctor to his charity work. As they walked away, he called back over his shoulder. Enjoy your stay, Mrs. Thompson. Millbrook has a way of testing newcomers. Some find their place, others. He left the threat hanging in the air like smoke. When they were out of earshot, Dr. Hayes shook his head with visible disgust. I apologize for that welcome, Mrs. Thompson. Victor Caldwell thinks he runs this town because he carries messages for the territorial government. Unfortunately, he's not entirely wrong about his influence. I've dealt with his type before, Maya said, though she was grateful for the doctor's intervention. You mentioned he was wrong about something. About Mrs. Bennet, Dr. Hayes replied. Ruth's practical above all else. She might not be warm, but she's fair, and she needs the income from her rooms. The real question is whether you're prepared for the kind of work that's available here. Maya touched her wedding ring absently, a gesture that didn't escape the observant physician's notice. My husband died in a factory accident in Cleveland 4 months ago. I've been traveling west looking for a fresh start, somewhere I can raise my child in peace. I'm not afraid of hard work, doctor. I've done laundry, cooking, cleaning, whatever was needed. Dr. Hayes nodded with the understanding of a man who'd seen his share of tragedy and resilience. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thompson. As for work, there might be an opportunity, though it's not exactly what you'd expect. Before Maya could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. But these weren't the casual sounds of townspeople going about their business. This was the disciplined rhythm of a skilled rider moving with purpose and urgency. The horse that rounded the corner of Main Street was magnificent, a black stallion whose coat gleamed like polished coal in the afternoon sun. But it was the rider who commanded attention. Even seated in the saddle, his presence filled the street with an authority that made conversations stop and heads turn. James Morrison was perhaps 35 years old, with the broad shoulders and steady hands of a man who'd spent his life working with animals and weather that could kill the unprepared. His dark hair showed traces of premature gray at the temples, and his face bore the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years spent under the Montana sky. But it was his eyes that told the real story, deep brown eyes that held shadows of loss, and a carefully controlled pain that spoke of wounds that went deeper than any physical injury. He wore practical clothes, well made but not flashy, and his horse's tack spoke of both quality and careful maintenance. This was a man who understood that on the frontier, your equipment could mean the difference between life and death. Doc, he said, his voice carrying the low, measured tones of someone who chose his words carefully. Heard there was a new arrival on the afternoon stage. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with the ease of old friendship. Jake, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Maya Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, this is James Morrison. He owns the Broken Arrow Ranch about 5 miles north of town. Maya found herself looking up into those shadowed eyes and feeling an unexpected jolt of recognition. Not that she'd ever seen this man before, but she recognized the look of someone who'd learned to carry grief like a heavy pack, never setting it down but learning to move forward despite its weight. Morrison, she said, extending her hand with the directness she'd learned was necessary on the frontier. Dr. Hayes mentioned there might be work available. Jake Morrison studied her for a long moment, taking in her obvious pregnancy, her worn but clean traveling dress, and the determined set of her chin that suggested she was prepared to face whatever challenges came her way. What kind of work are you looking for, Mrs. Thompson? He asked, his tone neutral but not unkind. Washing, cooking, cleaning. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm reliable. Maya met his gaze directly, understanding that this was some kind of test. I can provide references from my previous employers. References won't matter much out here, Jake replied. What matters is whether you can handle the isolation. The Broken Arrow's a working ranch, Mrs. Thompson. It's not a place for someone looking for social company or town conveniences. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat. Jake, perhaps we should discuss the particulars somewhere more private. Mrs. Thompson's had a long journey, and standing in the street isn't comfortable for a woman in her condition. Jake glanced around and seemed to notice for the first time that their conversation had attracted an audience. Victor Caldwell and his friends had returned and were watching the interaction with obvious interest. Several women had emerged from various shops, ostensibly going about their business, but clearly listening to every word. You're right, Doc, Jake said, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd been riding since childhood. Mrs. Thompson, Would you be willing to ride out to the ranch? See the place before you decide if it's something you'd want to take on." Maya looked at the magnificent horse, then at her own condition, and finally at the man who was offering her what might be her only chance at employment in this town. "I've never ridden anything quite that impressive, Mr. Morrison. Will he tolerate a passenger?" For the first time since his arrival, Jake Morrison's expression softened slightly, and Maya caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had carved those lines around his eyes. "Thunder's got the patience of a saint," he said, patting the stallion's neck with obvious affection, "and I've got a gentle hand with the reins. But if you'd prefer, I can bring a wagon to town tomorrow." "Tomorrow I might not have anywhere to stay tonight," Maya replied, practically. "If Thunder's willing to tolerate me, I'm willing to trust your judgment." Dr. Hayes stepped forward with his medical bag. "I'll ride along, if you don't mind. I've been meaning to check on your foreman's shoulder anyway, and Mrs. Thompson should have medical supervision during travel, given her condition." Jake nodded, then looked back at Maya with something that might have been respect. "Fair enough. Doc's got his own horse, and Frank Murphy will want to meet you anyway. He's my foreman. And if you're going to work at the Broken Arrow, you'll be answering to him as much as to me." As Dr. Hayes disappeared into his office to collect his horse and additional supplies, Jake Morrison helped Maya mount Thunder with a gentleness that surprised her. Despite his size and obvious strength, his hands were careful and respectful, and he made sure she was secure before swinging up behind her. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice closer to her ear than she'd expected. "As comfortable as a woman in my condition can be on horseback," Maya replied, acutely aware of his solid presence behind her and the way his arms encircled her as he took up the reins. "We'll take it slow," Jake promised. "Thunder knows the way home, and he's got sense enough not to jostle a passenger unnecessarily." As they rode slowly out of Millbrook, Maya caught sight of Victor Caldwell watching their departure with obvious displeasure. Something about his expression suggested that her leaving town with Jake Morrison had disrupted plans she wasn't aware of. And that knowledge sent a small chill down her spine. "Mr. Morrison," she said as they cleared the town limits and entered the open range that stretched toward the distant mountains. "That man Caldwell seemed upset by our departure. Is there something I should know about the relationship between him and your ranch?" Jake was quiet for so long that Maya began to think he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying undertones of anger that he kept carefully controlled. "Victor Caldwell's been trying to convince me to sell the Broken Arrow for the past 2 years," he said. "Claims the railroad's going to need the land for expansion, and that I'd be smart to take their offer before they decide to use territorial authority to claim it anyway." "And you don't want to sell?" "The Broken Arrow's been in my family for 15 years, Jake replied, and Maya could hear the deep attachment in his voice. "My father built it from nothing, and my wife." He stopped abruptly, the sentence hanging unfinished in the air. Maya understood. Some wounds were too fresh to probe, even after years had passed. "It's your home," she said simply. "It's my home," Jake agreed. "And it's going to stay that way, no matter what kind of pressure Caldwell and his territorial friends try to apply." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of Thunder's gait lulling Maya into a state of cautious relaxation. The Montana landscape stretched around them in all directions, vast and beautiful and utterly unforgiving. Rolling hills covered in golden grass led the eye toward distant mountains that promised harsh winters, and the kind of isolation that could either break a person or forge them into something stronger than they'd ever imagined possible. Dr. Hayes caught up to them on a sturdy base, his medical bag secured behind his saddle, and his face showing the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed an afternoon ride through country he'd learned to love. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, bringing his horse alongside Thunder. "Any discomfort from the ride?" "Nothing I can't handle," Maya replied truthfully. though I admit I'm curious about what we'll find at the Broken Arrow. Mr. Morrison's been rather mysterious about the specific nature of the work. Jake shifted slightly behind her, and she could sense his discomfort with the topic. It's not mysterious exactly. It's just that the situation at the ranch is. He searched for the right words. Unconventional. Dr. Hayes chuckled, a sound that held both affection and exasperation. What Jake's trying to say, Mrs. Thompson, is that he's been living like a hermit for the past 3 years. The ranch house needs a woman's touch, and Jake needs human company whether he wants to admit it or not. Doc, Jake warned, but there was no real anger in his voice. I'm not saying anything that isn't true, Dr. Hayes continued mildly. The Broken Arrow's a fine ranch, Mrs. Thompson, but it's been run by men who care more about the cattle than they do about comfort. If you're looking for employment that comes with room and board, Jake's offer is probably the best you'll find in 3 counties. Maya absorbed this information, understanding that there were currents beneath the surface that she wasn't yet privy to. And the washing, Mr. Morrison specifically mentioned washing. The ranch hands generate a considerable amount of laundry, Jake said carefully. And I've been taking the wash into town once a month, which isn't practical for anyone involved. If you're willing to take on that responsibility, along with general household management, I can offer fair wages and comfortable accommodation. How fair? Maya asked, because she'd learned that survival depended on understanding exactly what resources would be available. $15 a month, plus room and board for you and the baby when it arrives. Jake replied without hesitation. There's a separate cabin on the property that would give you privacy while keeping you close enough to the main house for safety and convenience. Maya's breath caught. $15 a month was more than she'd made at any of her previous positions. And the promise of room and board meant security for both her and her child. It was the kind of offer that seemed too good to be true, which meant there had to be complications she wasn't seeing yet. What's the catch, Mr. Morrison? She asked directly. Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that surprised her. No catch, Mrs. Thompson. Just a man who's discovered that living alone isn't the same thing it can, and a ranch that could use the kind of care that only a woman can provide. As they crested a hill, and the Broken Arrow Ranch spread out below them, Maya understood why Jake Morrison was so determined to keep his land. The ranch house was built of local stone and timber, substantial without being pretentious, nestled in a valley that provided shelter from the worst weather, while offering access to the water and grassland that made cattle ranching possible. Outbuildings dotted the landscape with practical efficiency. A large barn dominated the area near the house, while corrals and smaller structures spoke of a working operation that had been built to last. In the distance she could see cattle grazing peacefully, their presence a testament to the success of the enterprise. But it was the silence that struck her most profoundly. After months of travel through crowded trains and busy towns, the peace of the Broken Arrow felt like a benediction. Here, a woman could raise a child safely, work with dignity, and perhaps find the fresh start that had driven her across half a continent. It's beautiful, she said simply, and meant it. My wife thought so too, Jake replied, his voice carrying the weight of memories both precious and painful. She used to say that anyone who could look at this valley and not feel grateful didn't understand what God intended when He made the world. Maya felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever complications she couldn't yet see, this place offered something she'd been searching for without knowing it. The possibility of home. Part 2. The Broken Arrow Ranch. The ranch house stood like a testament to endurance against the Montana sky, its stone foundation rising from the earth as if it had grown there naturally. Maya could see the care that had gone into its construction even from a distance. The logs were perfectly fitted, the roof showed no signs of weather damage, and smoke rose steadily from the chimney, suggesting warmth and life within. As they approached the main yard, a man emerged from the barn with the purposeful stride of someone who'd heard their arrival and come to investigate. Frank Murphy was perhaps 50 years old, with the lean build and weathered face of a lifetime cowhand. His left arm hung slightly stiff at his side, and Maya noticed how he favored his right shoulder when he moved. This must be the injury Dr. Hayes had mentioned. "Boss," Frank called out, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Wasn't expecting you back till evening." Jake dismounted and turned to help Maya down from Thunder's back, his hands steady and sure as he guided her safely to the ground. "Frank, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Maya Thompson. She's considering taking on the household management and laundry responsibilities we discussed." Frank studied Maya with the frank assessment of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly and accurately. She met his gaze directly, understanding that his approval would be crucial to her success at the Broken Arrow. "Ma'am," he said finally, touching his hat again. "Frank Murphy, foreman of this outfit. Jake tells me you're looking for steady work." "I am Mr. Murphy. I have experience with household management, cooking for large groups, and handling heavy laundry loads. I'm reliable, I don't complain about hard work, and I understand that ranch operations come first." Frank's weathered face creased into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "That's good to hear, ma'am. We run a tight operation here, but we're fair to folks who pull their weight." Dr. Hayes dismounted and immediately approached Frank with the focused attention of a physician examining a patient. "How's that shoulder been treating you, Frank? Any increased stiffness or pain?" "Nothing I can't handle, Doc," Frank replied, though Maya noticed him rolling the shoulder slightly as if testing its range of motion. "Been doing the exercises you showed me, and it's improving steady. I'll want to take a look before I head back to town," Dr. Hayes said firmly. "Thompson, would you like to see the accommodations Jake mentioned, while I examine my stubborn patient here?" Jake gestured toward a smaller building that sat perhaps 100 yards from the main house. "The cabin's over there. It was built for my father's sister when she came west with her children after her husband died. It's been empty for 2 years, but it's sound and should suit your needs." They walked across the yard together, Maya's eyes taking in the details that spoke of a well-managed operation. The barn was substantial and well-maintained. The corrals were in excellent repair, and she could see several ranch hands working with horses in the distance. Everything spoke of prosperity and careful stewardship. The cabin proved to be larger than she'd expected, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that shared a chimney with the main house. The furniture was simple but well made, and large windows faced east and south, promising good light during the day. Best of all, it felt private and safe, like a place where a woman could raise a child without constantly worrying. "The well's just outside the back door," Jake explained, pointing to a stone-lined opening in the ground. "Water's good and cold year-round. There's a root cellar for storage, and the privy's about 50 feet that direction, screened by those cottonwoods for privacy." Maya walked through the cabin slowly, imagining how it would feel to have her own space again after months of temporary lodging and uncertain welcome. The main room would serve as both sitting area and kitchen, while the smaller room would be perfect for sleeping. When the baby came, there would be plenty of space for a cradle and all the necessities of new motherhood. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "More than I dared hope for." Jake seemed relieved by her approval, though he tried to hide it. "The work's not easy, Mrs. Thompson. Ranch hands are hard on clothes, and they eat like they're trying to store up for winter hibernation." Frank's wife used to handle the household duties, but she passed 2 years ago, and we've been making do with bachelor arrangements ever since. Something in his tone made Maya look at him more carefully. Frank's wife, Margaret Murphy. She was. Jake paused, searching for words. "She was the heart of this place.
kept us all fed and civilized, made sure the men remembered their manners, and wrote letters to their families. When we lost her, we lost more than just household help. Maya understood then that she wasn't just being hired to wash clothes and cook meals. She was being asked to fill a role that had deep emotional significance for everyone at the Broken Arrow. The knowledge was both daunting and oddly comforting. These men needed what she could provide, and she needed the security
Could offer. How many hands work the ranch full-time? She asked, already calculating the scope of the laundry and cooking responsibilities. 8 year-round, plus Frank and myself. During roundup and branding, we might have as many as 15 for a few weeks. Most of the seasonal hands bring their own bedding and take care of their personal washing, but they expect meals and a place to clean up. Maya nodded, her mind organizing the logistics. I'll need to see the kitchen facilities and understand what supplies are available. Also, I'll want to know about laundry arrangements. Do you have washing facilities, or will I need to set up my own system? Jake's expression showed a mixture of relief and respect. Frank can show you everything after Doc finishes torturing him. But Mrs. Thompson, I want to be clear about something. This isn't charity, and it's not a temporary arrangement. If you take this position, I'm counting on you to stay at least through the winter. These men need stability, and I won't have them getting attached to someone who's just passing through. The words carried an edge that suggested personal experience with loss and disappointment. Maya suspected that Jake Morrison's reluctance to trust came from more than just concern for his ranch hands. Mr. Morrison, I'm not looking for temporary work. I'm looking for a place to build a life for myself and my child. If the Broken Arrow can provide that, you'll have my loyalty and my best effort for as long as you need them. Something shifted in Jake's expression, a crack in the careful wall he maintained around his emotions. In that case, Mrs. Thompson, welcome to the Broken Arrow Ranch. They walked back toward the main house, where Dr. Hayes was finishing his examination of Frank's shoulder. Maya could hear the doctor's voice carrying across the yard as he explained proper care and movement techniques, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his medical advice followed without question. Frank's healing well, Dr. Hayes announced as they approached. But he needs to be more careful about overextending that arm. Ranch work doesn't wait for injuries to heal completely. But permanent damage isn't worth the short-term convenience. Frank was rolling his shoulder experimentally, testing the range of motion. Feels better than it has in weeks. Doc, your exercises are working. They'll work better if you actually do them regularly, instead of when you remember. Dr. Hayes replied dryly. He turned to Maya with the focused attention of a physician examining a new patient. Mrs. Thompson, how are you feeling after the ride? Any discomfort or unusual symptoms? Nothing concerning, doctor. Though I admit I'm looking forward to putting my feet up for a few minutes. When is the baby due? Dr. Hayes asked, his professional manner making the personal question feel routine rather than intrusive. Early December. Based on my calculations, this will be my first child, so I'm not entirely certain about the timing. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. December births can be challenging out here, especially if we get an early blizzard. But the Broken Arrow's isolated enough that you'll have peace and quiet, and Jake can always send someone to fetch me if there are complications. Jake stepped forward, and Maya noticed how naturally he seemed to accept responsibility for her welfare. Doc, I want you to check on Mrs. Thompson regularly. Whatever your usual fee is, the ranch will cover it. That's very generous, Mr. Morrison, but I can pay for my own medical care. Maya interjected, not wanting to begin her employment as a burden on the ranch's finances. Mrs. Thompson, Jake said firmly, you'll be living 5 miles from the nearest doctor and handling responsibilities that affect everyone who works here. Making sure you and the baby stay healthy isn't generosity. It's practical business sense. Frank nodded his agreement. Boss is right, ma'am. Out here we take care of our own. That's how operations like this survive. Maya felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. For the first time in months, she was being treated not as a burden or charity case, but as a valued member of a community. The feeling was both wonderful and terrifying, because it meant she had something to lose again. In that case, gentlemen, I accept your terms. When would you like me to start? Jake and Frank exchanged glances, and Maya caught something in their silent communication that suggested they'd been hoping for this outcome. How about tomorrow morning? Frank suggested. I can ride into town this evening and collect your belongings. Save you the trip. I don't have much, Maya admitted. Just the bag I brought with me today. Then how about we give you a proper tour of the facilities now and you can start fresh tomorrow? Jake suggested. Frank can show you the kitchen and laundry setup while I see to Thunder and the other horses. The kitchen proved to be larger and better equipped than Maya had expected. A massive wood-burning stove dominated one wall, with multiple ovens and cooking surfaces that could handle meals for a dozen hungry men. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with basic supplies and cooking equipment that showed signs of regular use but careful maintenance. Margaret had everything organized just so. Frank explained, opening cupboards and drawers to show Maya the layout. She could feed 20 men without breaking a sweat, and somehow always had fresh bread and coffee ready when folks needed them. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, scarred by years of use but solid and functional. Maya could envision it covered with rising bread dough in the morning and laden with hearty meals in the evening. Windows on two sides provided excellent light, and she noticed that someone had built a clever system of hooks and pulleys near the ceiling for hanging herbs and other items that needed to dry. The pantry's through here, Frank continued, leading her to a smaller room lined with shelves and barrels. We get supplies from town monthly, plus whatever we can produce here on the ranch. There's a good garden plot behind the house, though it's pretty much finished for the season now. Maya nodded, already planning how she would organize the space to maximize efficiency. What about water for the kitchen? Is there a pump, or do I need to carry it from the well? There's a hand pump right there by the sink. Frank pointed to a cast iron mechanism she hadn't noticed. Jake's father was clever about engineering. The same system that feeds the cabin well also services the house. The laundry facilities were located in a separate building behind the kitchen, equipped with large tubs, a heating system for water, and multiple clotheslines strung between posts. It was clearly designed by someone who understood the scope of washing required by a working ranch. This is impressive, Maya said, examining the setup with professional appreciation. Much better than anything I've worked with before. Margaret designed it herself, Frank said with obvious pride. She said if she was going to spend half her life washing clothes, she was going to do it as efficiently as possible. As they completed the tour, Maya began to understand the scope of what she was taking on. This wasn't just a job. It was a position of real responsibility within a functioning community. The men who worked the Broken Arrow depended on the smooth operation of the household, and Margaret Murphy had clearly set a high standard for performance. Frank, she said, as they walked back toward the main house, I want you to know that I understand I'm not replacing Mrs. Murphy. No one could do that. But I promise you that I'll do my best to take care of the men and maintain the standards she established. Frank stopped walking and turned to face her, his weathered face showing more emotion than she'd seen since their introduction. Ma'am, that's exactly what we hoped you'd say. Margaret would have liked you. I think. She had a soft spot for folks who weren't afraid of hard work and honest responsibility. Jake emerged from the barn as they approached, having unsaddled Thunder and seen to the horse's care. Dr. Hayes was securing his medical bag and preparing for the ride back to town. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Hayes said, mounting his bay mare with the ease of long practice. I'll plan to check on you in 2 weeks sooner if you need me. Jake knows how to reach me in town if there are any concerns. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate your kindness more than I can express. Kindness has nothing to do with it, Dr. Hayes replied with a slight smile. I'm a practical man, and having a competent woman managing the Broken Arrow household benefits everyone in the county. These ranches are the backbone of our economy, and anything that makes them run more smoothly helps the whole community. As the doctor rode away, Maya found herself alone with Jake and Frank in the gathering dusk. The mountains in the distance were turning purple with shadow, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky. We should get you settled in the cabin, Jake said, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to emerge when he wasn't actively trying to maintain his emotional distance. Tomorrow will be a full day, and you'll need your rest. The cabin felt different in the evening light, cozier and more welcoming than it had during the afternoon tour. Frank had thoughtfully laid a fire in the fireplace, and the warm light danced on the walls, creating an atmosphere of comfort and safety. "There are extra blankets in the chest there," Jake explained, pointing to a wooden box near the window. "Food supplies are in the kitchen, and Frank made sure there's coffee and fresh water. If you need anything during the night, the main house is just across the yard." Maya stood in the doorway of what would be her new home, looking out at the ranch buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt something approaching peace. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "thank you, not just for the job, but for treating me with dignity and respect. It's been a long time since anyone offered me both work and genuine kindness." Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to emotional expressions of gratitude. "You'll earn every cent of your wages, Mrs. Thompson. Don't mistake practical business for charity." But Maya had seen the care with which he'd helped her from the horse, noticed the way he'd automatically accepted responsibility for her medical care, observed his obvious concern for her comfort and safety. Jake Morrison might want to frame his kindness as practical business, but she recognized genuine compassion when she encountered it. "Good night, Mr. Morrison. I'll see you in the morning." "Good night, Mrs. Thompson." "And Mrs. Thompson, welcome home." As Jake's footsteps faded across the yard, Maya closed the cabin door and turned to examine her new surroundings by firelight. The simple furniture seemed to glow with warmth and possibility. For the first time in months, she was alone in a space that belonged to her, however temporarily. She could make decisions about how to arrange things, when to sleep, what to eat for breakfast. Small freedoms perhaps, but precious ones for a woman who'd been dependent on others' charity for too long. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movement beneath her palm. "Well, little one," she whispered to her unborn child, "it looks like we've found ourselves a place to land. Your mama's going to work hard to make sure we can stay here, and maybe, just maybe, we can build something good in this beautiful wild place." Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and in the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle settling for the night. The sounds of the Broken Arrow Ranch were becoming familiar already, wrapping around her like a promise of belonging. Maya Thompson fell asleep that night, to the sound of Montana wind and the crackle of her own fire, dreaming for the first time in months of a future that held more than mere survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the test of whether she could truly fill the role that Margaret Murphy had left vacant. But tonight, she was home. The first rays of sunrise found Maya already awake, standing at her cabin window and watching the ranch come to life around her. Frank was moving between the corrals with the efficient purpose of a man who'd performed the same morning routine for decades. Other ranch hands were emerging from the bunkhouse, their voices carrying across the crisp air as they discussed the day's work plans. She could see Jake near the barn, examining one of the horses with the careful attention of someone who understood that in this environment, animal health could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. Even from a distance, his movements showed the confidence of a man completely at home in his world. Maya dressed quickly and made her way to the main house, eager to begin her first day of work at the Broken Arrow Ranch. The kitchen was larger and more intimidating in the early morning light, but she'd worked in challenging conditions before. The key was organization, efficiency, and the kind of attention to detail that could turn chaos into smooth routine. Coffee first, she decided. Working men needed coffee the way horses needed water, and everything else could wait until that fundamental requirement was satisfied. She found the coffee supplies exactly where Frank had indicated, along with a massive pot designed to serve a crowd. As the coffee began to brew, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, Maya started planning the day's meals. She'd need to take inventory of available supplies, understand the men's preferences and dietary requirements, and establish routines that would serve everyone's needs efficiently. The sound of boots on the porch announced the arrival of her first customers. Frank appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, with the respectful manner of a man entering a woman's domain. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson. Coffee smells like heaven itself." "Good morning, Frank."
Coffee's almost ready, and I'm planning a substantial breakfast. How many men should I expect? 8 for breakfast, plus Jake and myself. The boys are used to pretty basic fare, but they appreciate good cooking when they can get it. Maya smiled, feeling the familiar satisfaction of useful work beginning. Then they'll have good cooking. I believe in feeding people properly, especially men who work. As Frank poured himself the first cup of coffee, his expression showed unmistakable relief. Ma'am, I think you're going to work out just fine here at the Broken Arrow. Maya Thompson, late of Cleveland, Ohio, began her first morning as household manager of the Broken Arrow Ranch, with the confidence of a woman who'd finally found her place in the world. The work would be demanding, the isolation challenging, and the responsibility significant. But for the first time since Daniel's death, she was exactly where she belonged. Part 3. Hidden Strengths and Growing Bonds. The morning sun was climbing steadily over the eastern ridge when Maya heard the thunder of hoofbeats, approaching the ranch house at a pace that spoke of urgency rather than routine. She looked up from the bread dough she was kneading to see a young cowhand racing his horse toward the barn, dust flying behind him like a signal of distress. Through the kitchen window, she watched Jake emerge from the barn and catch the horse's reins as the rider dismounted in obvious agitation. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in both men's postures as they engaged in rapid conversation, their voices too low to carry, but their gestures speaking of serious trouble. Frank appeared from the direction of the corrals, moving faster than his injured shoulder usually allowed, and joined the urgent conference. Maya found herself holding her breath as she watched the three men, understanding instinctively that whatever news had arrived would affect everyone at the Broken Arrow. After several minutes of intense discussion, Jake strode toward the house with the determined gait of a man who'd made difficult decisions and was prepared to act on them. His face when he entered the kitchen showed the kind of controlled concern that Maya had learned to recognize in men who carried responsibility for others' welfare. "Mrs. Thompson," he said without preamble, "we have a situation developing that might affect ranch operations for the next few days. I wanted you to understand what's happening so you can prepare accordingly." Maya set aside her bread dough and gave him her full attention. "What kind of situation, Mr. Morrison?" "Cattle rustlers hit the Morrison spread south of here last night, took nearly 50 head, and left young Tommy Morrison tied up in his own barn. The boy's not seriously hurt, but he's shaken, and his father's calling for every rancher in the territory to help track down the thieves." The word sent a chill through Maya that had nothing to do with the morning air. Cattle rustling was more than simple theft in this country. It was an attack on the foundation of everything these men had built with years of backbreaking work. "How does this affect the Broken Arrow?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Frank and I will be riding out with most of the hands to join the search party. We can't let this kind of thing go unanswered, or it'll spread like wildfire through the territory. But that means leaving you here with only Charlie and Pete to handle the basic ranch operations." Maya nodded, understanding both the necessity of the action and the implications for her own situation. "How long will you be gone?" "Could be 3 days, could be a week, depending on how far the trail leads us. The problem is, we can't postpone this. Every hour we wait makes the thieves harder to track." "What do you need me to do?" Jake's expression showed a mixture of respect and concern. "Keep the home place running. Charlie and Pete can handle the essential livestock care, but they'll need regular meals and someone to coordinate basic operations. Are you comfortable taking on that responsibility?" Maya felt a surge of determination that surprised her with its intensity. These men were trusting her with the care of their home base while they rode into potential danger to protect their livelihood. It was exactly the kind of meaningful responsibility she'd been hoping to find. "You can count on me, Mr. Morrison. I'll take care of everything here." "There's more," Jake continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "With most of the men gone, you'll be relatively isolated out here. Charlie and Pete are good men, but they're both past their prime for serious fighting if trouble comes calling. I want you to understand that if anything feels wrong, if you see riders you don't recognize, or anything that makes you uncomfortable, you take the buggy and head straight for town. The implication was clear. The same men who would steal cattle might not hesitate to threaten a woman alone on an isolated ranch. Maya felt her hand move instinctively to her belly, where her unborn child depended entirely on her good judgment and quick thinking. I understand. Morrison, what about the regular ranch operations? Feeding the animals, checking on the cattle that remain, maintaining the basic routines. Charlie knows what needs doing, and Pete's got experience with most everything around here. But Mrs. Thompson, I need you to promise me that you won't try to handle anything beyond the household responsibilities. Your safety and the baby's welfare are more important than any ranch operations. Maya met his eyes directly, seeing genuine concern there that went beyond mere employer consideration for an employee. I promise to be careful and sensible, but I also promise that the broken arrow will be running smoothly when you return. Jake studied her face for a long moment, and Maya had the sense that he was measuring her character against some internal standard. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because his shoulders relaxed slightly. Frank's going to show you where we keep the emergency supplies and explain the procedures for handling problems. Charlie and Pete will look out for you, but ultimately, you'll be the one making decisions about daily operations. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Jake replied, and the confidence in his voice sent warmth through Maya's chest. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else. If we're not back within a week, I want you to send Charlie to town to fetch Dr. Hayes. Not because I expect trouble, but because a woman in your condition shouldn't be without medical supervision for extended periods. The thoughtfulness of the instruction touched Maya deeply. Even facing potential danger and the loss of valuable livestock, Jake Morrison was considering her welfare and that of her unborn child. Thank you. That means more to me than you probably realize. Jake shifted uncomfortably, as he always did when conversations became too personal. It's practical consideration, nothing more. Now, I need to finish organizing the men and supplies. We'll be riding out within the hour. After Jake left to continue his preparations, Maya found herself alone in the kitchen with a dozen different thoughts competing for attention. The bread dough demanded immediate care, but her mind was already racing ahead to the challenges of managing ranch operations with a skeleton crew. Frank appeared in the doorway as she was shaping the risen dough into loaves, his expression showing the focused intensity of a man preparing for serious business. Mrs. Thompson, Jake asked me to go over some things with you before we ride out. Important things you'll need to know while we're gone. Of course, let me get these loaves in the oven, and I'll give you my complete attention. Frank waited patiently while she completed her baking preparations, then led her to a small room off the kitchen that served as ranch office and record-keeping center. Maps covered one wall, showing not only the broken arrow's boundaries, but also neighboring ranches and the complex network of trails and water sources that connected them. This here's the heart of ranch operations, Frank explained, gesturing toward a large desk covered with ledgers, correspondence, and detailed notes. Jake keeps track of everything that happens here, from cattle counts, to feed purchases to personnel records. Maya examined the papers with growing respect for the complexity of ranch management. These weren't the simple operations she'd imagined. They were sophisticated business enterprises requiring careful planning, detailed record-keeping, and constant attention to changing conditions. Mrs. Thompson, I need to show you something that most folks don't know about. Frank moved to a wall cabinet and opened it to reveal a small arsenal, rifles, handguns, ammunition, and other supplies that spoke of serious preparation for trouble. Jake's father was a careful man who understood that out here, you have to be ready for anything. These weapons are cleaned and loaded, and there's ammunition for extended use if necessary. Maya stared at the weapons, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Mr. Murphy, I should tell you that I've never handled firearms. My husband believed that guns were for soldiers and lawmen, not ordinary citizens. Frank nodded without judgment. Ma'am, I respect that philosophy, but out here, circumstances can change faster than you'd expect. I'm not asking you to become a gunfighter, but I want you to know these resources are available if absolute necessity arises. He selected a small revolver from the collection and demonstrated its basic operation with the patient manner of an experienced teacher. This one's simple and reliable. Point it where you want the bullet to go, pull the trigger, and it'll do the rest. But Mrs. Thompson, never draw this weapon unless you're absolutely certain you're prepared to use it. Maya accepted the gun with careful reverence, understanding that she was crossing a threshold between her old life and the realities of frontier existence. The weight of the weapon in her hands felt heavier than its actual mass, loaded with implications about the dangers that might threaten her new home. I hope I never need to use it, she said quietly. That's exactly the right attitude, ma'am. But sometimes hoping isn't enough, and preparation is the difference between survival and tragedy. Frank spent the next hour explaining ranch emergency procedures, showing Maya how to signal for help, demonstrating the care and feeding protocols for the essential animals, and reviewing the locations of critical supplies. By the time he finished, Maya felt somewhat overwhelmed but determined to prove worthy of the trust being placed in her. The departure scene was both impressive and sobering. Jake had assembled 6 experienced riders, all armed and equipped for extended travel in potentially hostile territory. Their horses were strong and fresh, their supplies carefully organized, and their collective demeanor spoke of men who understood the seriousness of their mission. Charlie Wilson and Pete Hendricks, the 2 hands remaining behind, were both men past 50, who'd spent their entire adult lives working cattle ranches. Charlie was tall and lean with silver hair, and the kind of calm competence that inspired confidence. Pete was shorter and broader, with hands that showed the wear of decades spent handling rope reins and tools. Mrs. Thompson, Charlie said, touching his hat respectfully, Pete and I want you to know that we'll do everything possible to keep things running smooth while the boss is away. You just worry about the household operations, and let us handle the livestock. I appreciate that, Charlie, but I want both of you to know that I'm here to help with whatever needs doing. Don't hesitate to ask if you need an extra pair of hands or someone to coordinate activities. Pete stepped forward with a shy smile. Ma'am, it's been a long time since we had a woman's touch around the ranch operations. Margaret Murphy, she had a way of keeping us all organized and thinking ahead of problems instead of just reacting to them. I'll do my best to follow her example, Maya replied, understanding that she was being given both a compliment and a challenge. Jake approached on Thunder, the big stallion dancing with excitement at the prospect of extended travel. Even mounted, Jake's presence commanded attention, and Maya found herself looking up at a man who seemed perfectly designed for this harsh, beautiful country. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying easily despite the noise of horses in preparation. We'll send word back as soon as we can about our progress. Don't worry if you don't hear anything for several days. Tracking rustlers isn't quick work. Be careful out there, Mr. Morrison. The broken arrow needs you to come back safely. Something in Jake's expression softened at her words, and for a moment, Maya saw past the careful emotional walls he maintained to the man who'd learned to carry loss like an old injury that ached in bad weather. Keep things together here, Mrs. Thompson. I'm counting on you. As the search party rode out in a cloud of dust and determination, Maya stood in the ranch yard watching until they disappeared over the eastern ridge. The sudden silence that followed their departure felt almost oppressive after the noise and activity of preparation. Well, ma'am, Charlie said, breaking the quiet, I guess it's just us 3 holding down the fort. Pete and I will get started on
The morning livestock check. You holler if you need anything at all. Maya returned to the kitchen with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. For the next week, possibly longer, she would be the senior authority at the Broken Arrow Ranch. It was both the opportunity she'd hoped for and a responsibility that felt almost overwhelming. The day passed quickly as Maya established new routines adapted to the smaller crew. Cooking for 3 people instead of 10 was almost relaxingly simple, but she found herself constantly alert to sounds from outside, listening for anything that might indicate problems with the livestock or approaching visitors. Charlie and Pete proved to be excellent companions, respectful of her authority, but helpful with their decades of ranch experience. They joined her for meals with the easy camaraderie of people who understood they were all working toward common goals. Mrs. Thompson, Pete said over dinner, "I got to say, you've taken to ranch life like you were born to it. Margaret always said that some folks are naturally suited to this country, and others never quite fit no matter how long they stay. This place feels like home in a way I didn't expect," Maya admitted. "There's something about the rhythm of ranch life, the connection to the land and the animals, that satisfies something deep inside me. That's the Montana Territory working its magic," Charlie observed. "Gets into your blood and makes everywhere else seem too crowded and too tame." As evening settled over the ranch, Maya found herself standing on the porch of her cabin, looking out over the valley that stretched toward the distant mountains. The cattle were settling for the night, their low calls drifting across the pastures like a lullaby. The horses in the corrals were calm and content, and the entire ranch seemed to breathe with the steady rhythm of a well-ordered life. For the first time since arriving at the Broken Arrow, Maya allowed herself to imagine a permanent future here, not just as an employee, but as someone who truly belonged to this place and contributed to its success. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, because it meant opening her heart to possibilities that could be taken away. The second day of Jake's absence brought unexpected challenges that tested Maya's growing confidence in her ranch management abilities. She woke before dawn to the sound of cattle lowing in obvious distress, a sound that brought her instantly alert with concern. Charlie was already up and moving toward the corrals when Maya emerged from her cabin, pulling a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. The older cowhand's face showed the kind of focused concern that indicated serious problems. "What's wrong?" Maya called out as she hurried to join him. "Not sure yet, ma'am, but something's got the animals spooked. Could be predators, could be weather moving in, could be something else entirely." Pete appeared from the barn carrying a lantern, its yellow light creating dancing shadows as he moved toward the source of the disturbance. "Charlie, looks like we got fence damage on the north pasture. Several posts down, and I can see cattle moving around where they shouldn't be." Maya felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Fence damage meant cattle could wander off ranch property, potentially becoming lost or mixing with neighboring herds. In the absence of the regular crew, such problems could quickly become disasters. "What do we need to do?" she asked, understanding that this was exactly the kind of situation Jake had worried about when he'd left her in charge. "Pete and I need to get out there and assess the damage, then start repairs," Charlie explained. "Depending on how bad it is, we might need to round up strays and rebuild significant sections of fence. What can I do to help?" Charlie and Pete exchanged glances, and Maya could see them weighing her pregnancy against the immediate needs of ranch operations. "Ma'am," Pete said carefully, "fence repair is hard physical work, and with your condition." "My condition doesn't prevent me from thinking or organizing," Maya interrupted firmly. "What supplies will you need? How can I coordinate the work to make it more efficient?" Charlie's weathered face cracked into a smile of approval. "Mrs. Thompson, you're starting to sound like a real ranch manager. We'll need wire posts, tools, and probably some help moving cattle back where they belong." Maya spent the morning organizing supplies and coordinating the repair efforts with the efficiency she developed during years of managing complex household operations. She couldn't do heavy physical work, but she could ensure that Charlie and Pete had everything they needed when they needed it, eliminating wasted time and effort. By midday, the fence was repaired, the stray cattle were back in their proper pasture, and Maya had gained new respect for the complexity of ranch operations. She'd also discovered that she possessed natural organizational abilities that translated perfectly to agricultural management. "Mrs. Thompson," Charlie said as they shared a well-deserved lunch, "I got to say you handled that situation better than some ranch foremen I've worked with. You got the mind for this kind of work." "Thank you, Charlie. I'm learning that ranch management involves many of the same skills as running a large household, just on a bigger scale with different problems. Pete nodded his agreement. Margaret used to say that ranching was just housekeeping applied to the whole outdoors. You got to keep everything organized, plan ahead for problems, and make sure all the pieces work together smooth. Maya felt a warm glow of satisfaction at the comparison to Margaret Murphy. She was beginning to understand that the former ranch manager had been more than just a housekeeper. She'd been a full partner in ranch operations. Someone whose judgment and abilities had been essential to the Broken Arrow's success. The third day brought visitors that tested Maya's judgment in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was hanging laundry when she heard approaching horses, but these weren't the familiar sounds of ranch business. These riders were moving with the careful deliberation of people who weren't certain of their welcome. 3 men appeared at the ranch entrance, well-dressed and mounted on quality horses that suggested business rather than ranch work. Maya recognized the lead rider immediately, Victor Caldwell, the man who'd bothered her in Millbrook, accompanied by 2 companions who wore the kind of clothes that marked them as territorial officials or businessmen. Charlie emerged from the barn and moved to intercept the visitors, his posture showing the subtle alertness of an experienced ranch hand evaluating potential trouble. Maya could see him calculating distances and positioning himself between the strangers and the main house. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Charlie called out with careful politeness. "Can I help you with something?" Caldwell dismounted and approached with the confident manner of someone accustomed to having his authority recognized. "Charlie Wilson, isn't it? I'm Victor Caldwell, assistant to the Territorial Land Commissioner. We're here on official business regarding the Broken Arrow Ranch." Maya felt her pulse quicken with apprehension. Something about Caldwell's tone and the formal nature of his introduction suggested trouble that went beyond casual social visits. "Mr. Morrison's not available right now," Charlie replied carefully. "He's away on ranch business. Perhaps you could come back when he returns. Actually, our business might be better conducted in Mr. Morrison's absence," Caldwell said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're here to conduct a preliminary survey for territorial development projects. The railroad's expansion plans require detailed information about land usage and property values." Pete had joined Charlie, and Maya could see both men evaluating the situation with the wariness of experienced frontiersmen who'd learned to recognize predators in human form. "I don't recall Jake mentioning any territorial surveys," Pete said slowly. "Seems like that's the kind of thing a property owner would be notified about in advance." One of Caldwell's companions, a thin man with pale eyes and expensive clothes, stepped forward with obvious impatience. "The territorial government doesn't require property owner permission to conduct preliminary surveys on lands that may be subject to eminent domain proceedings." The words hit Maya like cold water. Eminent domain meant the government could seize private property for public use, typically with compensation but not necessarily with the owner's consent. If the territorial government was eyeing the Broken Arrow for railroad expansion, Jake's determination to keep his land could become a legal battle he might not be able to win. Maya made a quick decision and walked toward the group with the confident manner of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned to project when dealing with difficult customers in her previous employment. "I'm Maya Thompson, household manager for the Broken Arrow Ranch. Perhaps I can help you understand our current situation." Caldwell's expression showed surprise and something that might have been calculation. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it? I remember you from town. I wasn't aware that you'd found employment here. Mr. Morrison was kind enough to offer me a position managing household operations. As his representative in his absence, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to return when he's available to discuss any territorial business personally." The thin man with expensive clothes stepped forward with obvious irritation. "Madam, territorial business doesn't wait for the convenience of individual property owners. We have legal authority to conduct necessary surveys with or without specific permission." Maya felt anger rise in her chest at the man's condescending tone, but she kept her voice level and professional. "I'm sure you do, sir. However, ranch operations are continuing during Mr. Morrison's absence, and I'm responsible for ensuring that nothing interferes with essential activities. Perhaps you could explain exactly what your survey would involve. Caldwell and his companions exchanged glances, and Maya caught something in their silent communication that suggested they hadn't expected to encounter organized resistance to their plans. Mrs. Thompson, Caldwell said with false reasonableness, we're simply here to measure boundaries, assess land usage, and document current improvements. It's routine territorial business that benefits everyone involved. In that case, Maya replied smoothly, you won't mind waiting for Mr. Morrison's return so that he can participate in discussions about his own property. I'm sure a man of your professional standing understands the importance of proper procedures. Charlie stepped forward with obvious approval of Maya's handling of the situation. Ma'am's right, gentlemen. Boss wouldn't appreciate strangers wandering around his property without his specific permission, especially when he's not here to supervise activities. The thin man's face reddened with frustration. This is highly irregular. Territorial authorities don't require permission from individual ranch hands or household employees. Maybe not, Pete said with deceptive mildness, but they might require permission from individual property owners, and Jake Morrison's the only one qualified to give that around here. Maya could see Caldwell weighing his options, clearly frustrated by the unexpected resistance but uncertain about how far he could push without creating legal complications. Mrs. Thompson, he said finally, when do you expect Mr. Morrison to return? Within the week, I believe. If you leave your contact information, I'll be sure he's notified of your visit and your interest in conducting surveys. That won't be necessary, Caldwell replied curtly. We'll return when it's more convenient. As the three men remounted their horses and rode away, Maya felt both relief and concern. She'd successfully defended the ranch against unwanted intrusion, but she suspected that Caldwell's visit represented the beginning of more serious pressure rather than the end of territorial interest in the Broken Arrow. Mrs. Thompson, Charlie said with obvious admiration, that was some fine handling of a difficult situation. You stood up to those men like you were born to ranch management. Thank you, Charlie. But I suspect we haven't seen the last of Mr. Caldwell and his territorial authority. When Mr. Morrison returns, he's going to need to know exactly what happened here. Pete nodded grimly. Ma'am, I think you're right about that. Those men weren't here for any routine survey. They were testing to see how much resistance they'd face if they decided to move against the Broken Arrow. Maya felt her hand move instinctively to her belly, where her unborn child seemed to respond to her emotional tension with increased movement. She'd found a home at the Broken Arrow Ranch, and now it appeared that home might be threatened by forces beyond their control. But she'd also discovered that she possessed strength and capabilities she hadn't known she had. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer the desperate woman who'd arrived in Millbrook begging for work. She was Maya Thompson, household manager of the Broken Arrow Ranch, and she was prepared to fight for what she'd helped build. The fourth day of Jake's absence dawned clear and cold, with the promise of winter carrying on the northern wind. Maya stood at her cabin window, watching frost sparkle on the grass, and thinking about the confrontation with Caldwell's group. Something about their visit continued to trouble her. A sense that she'd witnessed the opening moves of a larger conflict that would test everyone at the Broken Arrow. As she prepared breakfast for Charlie, Pete, and herself, Maya found her mind turning to questions about the territorial government's true intentions. Railroad expansion was certainly a legitimate concern, but Caldwell's manner had suggested something more personal than routine bureaucratic business. Charlie appeared in the kitchen doorway as she was setting out plates, his expression showing the kind of focused concern that had become familiar during Jake's absence. Mrs. Thompson, Pete and I been talking about yesterday's visitors, and we think there's some things you ought to know about the situation between Jake and the territorial authorities. Maya poured coffee for all three of them, and settled at the table with the attention she'd learned to give to important ranch business discussions. I'm listening, Charlie. I've suspected there's more to this than simple railroad surveys. Charlie and Pete exchanged glances, clearly weighing how much information to share with someone who was still relatively new to the Broken Arrow's operations. Ma'am, Pete began carefully. Jake's father bought this land 15 years ago from a man named Robert Caldwell. Victor Caldwell's uncle, as it happens. The sale was legal and properly recorded. But there's been bad feelings about it ever since. What kind of bad feelings? Charlie took over the explanation. Robert Caldwell thought he was selling marginal grazing land for a fair price. Turned out Jake's father had a better eye for water rights and grass quality than most folks realized. Within 5 years, the Broken Arrow was one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Maya began to understand the personal dimensions of the conflict. So Victor Caldwell might have family reasons for wanting to reclaim this land, beyond whatever territorial authority he represents. That's our thinking, ma'am. And with the railroad expansion providing legal justification, he might see this as his chance to get back land his family sold too cheap. Pete nodded his agreement. Jake's never talked about it directly, but we've noticed that territorial pressure on the ranch has increased significantly since Victor Caldwell got his government position. Maya felt pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to fit together in her mind. Jake's determination to keep his land, Caldwell's obvious hostility, the convenient timing of territorial surveys during Jake's absence. It all suggested a conflict that went beyond simple business disagreements. Charlie, Pete, if territorial authorities do have legal power to seize land for railroad expansion, what options does Mr. Morrison have to protect the ranch? The two older men looked uncomfortable, clearly reluctant to discuss possibilities that might include failure and loss. Ma'am, Charlie said finally, that's the kind of question that needs Jake's input. Legal matters are beyond what Pete and I can advise about. But Maya's mind was already working through possibilities, drawing on knowledge and experience she'd gained during her marriage to Daniel. Her late husband had worked in factory management, and she'd overheard countless discussions about labor disputes, legal challenges, and the ways that powerful interests could pressure smaller operators. What if the surveys they want to conduct are designed to find legal justifications for seizure rather than simply gathering information? She asked, what if they're looking for boundary disputes, tax irregularities, or environmental problems they could use as leverage? Pete's eyes sharpened with interest. Mrs. Thompson, that's a clever way of thinking about it. Jake's father was careful about legal matters, but 15 years is a long time for problems to develop without proper attention. Then perhaps we should use Mr. Morrison's absence to conduct our own survey, Maya suggested. Check property boundaries, review tax records, examine any legal documents that might be vulnerable to challenge. Charlie leaned forward with obvious excitement. Ma'am, that's the kind of thinking that could save the ranch if trouble develops. Where would we start? Maya felt a surge of confidence as she realized that her organizational abilities and practical experience could contribute significantly to protecting the Broken Arrow. We start with the ranch office. Every piece of paper, every record, every document that establishes legal ownership and proper management. If territorial authorities want to challenge this ranch, they'll have to prove their case with evidence. The rest of the morning was spent in the ranch office, systematically reviewing every document related to the Broken Arrow's legal status. Maya approached the task with the methodical thoroughness she'd learned during years of managing complex household accounts and correspondence. What she found both reassured and concerned her. Jake's father had indeed been careful about legal documentation, but some records showed gaps that could potentially be exploited by hostile authorities. Property tax payments were current, but boundary surveys hadn't been updated since the original purchase. Water rights were clearly established, but environmental compliance documentation was incomplete. Charlie, Maya said as they worked through the afternoon, these records show that Mr. Morrison's father was an honest, careful man, but not necessarily someone who anticipated legal challenges from territorial authorities. Jake's the same way, ma'am. Honest to a fault, but maybe not as suspicious as he ought to be about government intentions. Maya made careful notes about every potential vulnerability she identified,
understanding that knowledge would be their best defense against whatever pressure Caldwell and his associates planned to apply. As evening approached and she prepared dinner for their small group, Maya reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. She'd arrived at the Broken Arrow as a desperate woman seeking basic employment. Now she was actively participating in efforts to protect the ranch from external threats, using skills and knowledge she'd never imagined would be relevant to frontier life. The thought both exhilarated and frightened her. She was building something meaningful here, but that also meant she had something significant to lose. For the first time since Daniel's death, she was emotionally invested in outcomes beyond mere survival. After dinner, as Charlie and Pete settled in for evening card games and Maya prepared for another night in her cabin, she found herself standing once again on the porch, looking out over the valley that had become home. Tomorrow would mark 5 days since Jake's departure, and she found herself missing his presence more than she'd expected. Not just his authority and decision-making capability, but his quiet strength, his thoughtful consideration of others' welfare, and the way he'd made her feel valued and protected. Maya Thompson, household manager of the Broken Arrow Ranch, fell asleep that night with her hand resting on her belly and her mind full of plans for protecting everything she'd learned to care about. Jake Morrison and his men were somewhere in the Montana wilderness, pursuing cattle thieves and defending the principle that honest work deserved protection from predators. But here at the ranch headquarters, another kind of battle was being prepared. One fought with documents and legal knowledge rather than guns and horses. Maya was discovering that she possessed weapons she'd never recognized before: intelligence, organization, and the fierce determination of a woman defending her home and family. The war for the Broken Arrow Ranch was just beginning, and Maya Thompson intended to be ready for whatever came next. Part 4. The Final Stand and New Beginnings. The sound of multiple horses approaching at dawn on the 6th day brought Maya instantly awake with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Through her cabin window, she could see riders cresting the eastern ridge, but the early morning light made it impossible to determine whether they were Jake's returning party or unwelcome visitors with hostile intentions. Charlie emerged from the bunkhouse at the same moment Maya stepped onto her porch, both of them straining to identify the approaching group. The lead rider's posture and the distinctive silhouette of his mount gradually resolved into recognizable forms, and Maya felt profound relief wash over her as she realized Jake Morrison was finally coming home. But something about the group's arrangement suggested more than a simple successful return from tracking cattle thieves. Additional riders flanked the main party, and Maya could see what appeared to be prisoners with their hands bound, escorted by armed guards. Jake had apparently found more than just stolen cattle during his week-long absence. "Looks like the boss brought back some uninvited guests," Charlie observed with grim satisfaction as the party drew closer. "Pete, you better get the barn ready for extra horses and check that the storage shed's secure. Looks like we might be hosting some folks who'd rather not be here." Maya hurried to the kitchen to prepare coffee and a substantial breakfast for what would clearly be a larger group than she'd been expecting. Whatever had happened during Jake's tracking expedition, the men would be hungry, tired, and probably in need of hot food and strong coffee before they could properly explain their success. Jake dismounted near the barn with the fluid grace that had become familiar. But Maya noticed new lines of fatigue around his eyes, and a tension in his movements that spoke of hard days and difficult decisions. When he looked toward the house and saw her standing in the doorway, his expression softened with what might have been relief. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Good to see you keeping everything running smoothly. We've got some business to attend to, but I'll want a full report on ranch operations as soon as we get these prisoners secured." Frank appeared from the group of riders, looking weary but satisfied, leading 2 men whose sullen expressions and bound hands marked them as the captured cattle thieves. Behind them came several other ranchers, Maya didn't recognize. Men whose presence suggested that Jake's expedition had grown into something larger than simple cattle recovery. Mrs. Thompson, Frank called out with obvious pleasure. I hope you're ready to feed about 15 hungry men. We've been living on trail rations for a week, and Charlie's been bragging about your cooking until we're all near starving with anticipation. Maya smiled at the compliment, while her mind raced to calculate the logistics of feeding such a large group. Give me an hour, Mr. Murphy, and I'll have breakfast ready for an army. Coffee's already brewing if anyone needs immediate fortification. As the men began the process of securing prisoners and caring for their horses, Maya threw herself into meal preparation with the efficiency she'd developed during her time at the Broken Arrow. Bacon, eggs, biscuits, fried potatoes, and strong coffee for 15 men represented a significant cooking challenge. But she'd learned to take satisfaction in meeting such demands successfully. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway as she was turning bacon in the large skillet, his presence filling the room with the quiet authority she'd come to associate with his character. Even travel-stained and obviously exhausted, he commanded attention through sheer force of personality. Mrs. Thompson, before we eat, I need to know what happened here while we were gone. Any problems, any visitors, anything that seemed unusual or concerning. Maya set down her cooking fork and gave him her complete attention, understanding that her report might affect important decisions about ranch security and future operations. We had fence damage on the north pasture the second day you were gone. Charlie and Pete handled the repairs efficiently, and we recovered all the stray cattle without losses. No significant problems with livestock or basic operations. Jake nodded approvingly. Good work. What else? 3 men visited on the third day, claiming to represent territorial authorities conducting surveys for railroad expansion. Victor Caldwell led the group, accompanied by 2 men I didn't recognize. They wanted to examine ranch property without your permission or presence. Jake's expression darkened immediately, and Maya could see anger building behind his carefully controlled facade. What did you tell them? That any territorial business would need to wait for your return, and that ranch operations were continuing normally under my management. They weren't pleased with that response, but they left without causing immediate trouble. Caldwell specifically mentioned railroad surveys. Yes, and one of his companions made references. Mr. Morrison, I think they were testing to see how much resistance they'd encounter if they decided to move against the ranch legally. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through implications that extended beyond simple territorial bureaucracy. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd reached important conclusions. Mrs. Thompson, while we were tracking those cattle thieves, we discovered some things that put Caldwell's visit in a new light. Those rustlers weren't random criminals looking for easy targets. They were working for someone with specific knowledge of local ranch operations and territorial legal procedures. Maya felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Working for whom? We're still gathering evidence, but everything points toward a coordinated effort to pressure specific ranchers into selling their land below market
value. The cattle thefts were designed to create financial stress that would make territorial buyout offers seem attractive. The implications hit Maya like cold water. If territorial authorities were coordinating with criminals to pressure ranchers, then the Broken Arrow's legal protections might be worthless against opponents willing to operate outside the law. Mr. Morrison, during your absence, Charlie and Pete helped me review all ranch legal documents. We found some potential vulnerabilities that hostile authorities might exploit to challenge your ownership. Jake's eyes sharpened with interest. What kind of vulnerabilities? Boundary surveys that haven't been updated since your father's original purchase, environmental compliance documentation that's incomplete, and some tax records that show minor irregularities that could be exaggerated into major violations. You've been busy, Jake said with obvious approval. What's your assessment of our legal position? Maya had spent considerable time thinking about this question. drawing on knowledge she'd gained from Daniel's factory management experience and her own observations of how powerful interests operated. Legally, your ownership is solid if we can demonstrate proper compliance with all territorial requirements. But if opponents are willing to manufacture evidence or exploit minor irregularities, they might create enough legal confusion to justify seizure proceedings. Jake nodded grimly. That matches what we learned from interrogating the captured rustlers. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else you should know. This pressure isn't limited to the Broken Arrow. At least 6 other ranches in the territory have experienced similar problems, and 2 have already sold to territorial representatives at well below market value. Maya absorbed this information with growing anger at the systematic nature of the conspiracy. Honest ranchers were being driven from their land through coordinated criminal pressure, all under the legal cover of Territorial Development Authority. What can we do to stop it? That depends on how much support we can rally from other ranchers and territorial officials who aren't part of the conspiracy. But Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand that fighting this could put everyone at the ranch in serious danger. Maya met his eyes directly, her resolve strengthening rather than weakening at the prospect of conflict. Mr. Morrison, this ranch has become my home, and these people have become my family. I'm not running from a fight that determines whether we can keep what we've built together. Something shifted in Jake's expression at her words, a crack in the emotional walls he'd maintained since his wife's death. For a moment, Maya saw the man he might become if he allowed himself to trust in the possibility of building something lasting with another person. In that case, Mrs. Thompson, we'd better prepare for a war. The breakfast that followed was unlike any meal Maya had cooked since arriving at the Broken Arrow. 15 men crowded around the kitchen table, and additional seating brought in from other rooms. Their conversation focused on the evidence they'd gathered and the strategy they would need to protect their homes and livelihoods. Maya listened with growing understanding as the ranchers discussed the scope of the conspiracy against them. The territorial authorities weren't simply corrupt. They were operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used government power to steal private property under legal pretenses. Jake, said a weathered rancher named Tom Bradley, what you're proposing could get us all hanged if we're wrong about territorial support for our position. And what happens if we're right but do nothing? Jake replied firmly. They pick us off one by one until there's no one left to resist their expansion plans. Frank leaned forward with the intensity of a man who'd reached the limits of his patience. Boss, I've been working ranches for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this systematic pressure. These aren't honest business dealings or legitimate government authority. This is organized theft disguised as legal procedure. Maya found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to join the discussion. Gentlemen, may I suggest that we're approaching this problem backwards? Instead of trying to defend against their attacks, perhaps we should focus on exposing their criminal activity to higher authorities. The table fell silent as every man turned to look at her with expressions ranging from surprise to curiosity. Maya realized that she'd just inserted herself into a discussion that traditionally wouldn't include women, but she also understood that her perspective might offer solutions the men hadn't considered. Mrs. Thompson, Tom Bradley said carefully, what kind of exposure are you thinking about? The territorial representatives are operating under federal authority, which means their actions are subject to federal oversight. If we can document the coordination between territorial officials and criminal activities, we might be able to appeal directly to federal authorities who aren't part of the local conspiracy. Jake's eyes showed growing excitement as he considered her suggestion. That's brilliant, Mrs. Thompson. Federal authorities would have jurisdiction over territorial misconduct, and they'd be less susceptible to local political pressure. But how do we document criminal coordination? Frank asked practically. These men aren't likely to confess their activities voluntarily. Maya had been thinking about this problem since her confrontation with Caldwell's survey team. We use their own legal pretenses against them. If they claim to be conducting legitimate territorial surveys, we demand full documentation of their authority, detailed explanations of their procedures, and complete records of their activities. Force them to put their criminal activities on official record. Pete added with growing understanding. If they refuse, we have evidence of improper authority. If they comply, we have documentation of illegal procedures. Jake stood up from the table with the decisive movement of a man who'd reached important conclusions. Mrs. Thompson, that's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need. Gentlemen, I think we have the beginning of a plan that could not only save our ranches but also expose the entire criminal conspiracy. The next several hours were spent developing a detailed strategy for documenting territorial misconduct while protecting the ranches from immediate retaliation. Maya found herself at the center of planning discussions, her organizational abilities and strategic insights proving essential to coordinating the complex operation they were designing. As the visiting ranchers prepared to return to their own properties to implement coordinated resistance, Jake approached Maya with an expression that combined gratitude, respect, and something deeper that made her heart race with unexpected possibilities. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to know that your contributions today have probably saved not just the Broken Arrow but every honest ranch operation in the territory. You've proven yourself to be more than an employee here. You've become a true partner in everything we're building. Maya felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, understanding that she was being offered more than just professional recognition. Morrison, this ranch has given me everything I'd lost hope of finding: meaningful work, genuine community, and a place where I can build a future for my child. Fighting to protect that isn't heroic, it's simply necessary. Maya, Jake said, using her given name for the first time, there's something I need to tell you before this situation develops further. These past weeks, watching you manage ranch operations, seeing your strength and intelligence, understanding your commitment to protecting what we've built together, you've made me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond mere survival. Maya's breath caught at the implications of his words. She'd sensed the growing connection between them, but hearing him acknowledge it directly filled her with both joy and uncertainty. Jake, I need you to understand that my feelings for you aren't based on gratitude or dependency. You've shown me respect and kindness, but more than that, you've made me feel valued for who I am rather than pitied for my circumstances. And you've made me realize that honoring my wife's memory doesn't require living in permanent isolation from the possibility of love. They stood together in the kitchen where Maya had proven her worth as both household manager and strategic partner, surrounded by the evidence of successful collaboration and mutual respect. The moment felt suspended between past grief and future possibility, heavy with the weight of decisions that would affect not only their personal happiness but the welfare of everyone who depended on the Broken Arrow Ranch. Maya, Jake said quietly, when this fight with the territorial authorities is resolved, I'd like to ask you a question that goes beyond ranch management and strategic planning. Maya understood exactly what question he intended to ask, and her heart raced with the certainty of what her answer would be. And when you ask that question, Jake Morrison, I'll be ready with an answer that goes beyond employment arrangements and business partnerships. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their intimate conversation, but this time the riders were expected. Hayes appeared at the head of a small group that included Sheriff Garrett from Millbrook and a man Maya didn't recognize who wore the kind of formal clothes that suggested territorial or federal authority. Jake, Doctor, Hayes called out as he dismounted, I received your message about needing legal and medical support for territorial misconduct investigations. I brought Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Federal Marshal William Harrison to discuss the evidence you've gathered. Maya felt a surge of excitement as she realized that Jake had already begun implementing their strategy for appealing to higher authorities. The presence of a federal marshal suggested that their accusations were being taken seriously by officials with the power to challenge territorial corruption. Marshal Harrison proved to be a man in his 50s with the steady demeanor of someone accustomed to investigating complex criminal conspiracies. His questions were precise and knowledgeable, and his reactions to the evidence suggested genuine concern about the scope of territorial misconduct. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Thompson, Marshal Harrison said after reviewing the documents and testimony they'd assembled, what you've described represents one of the most sophisticated property theft operations I've encountered in 20 years of federal law enforcement. If your evidence proves accurate, we're looking at criminal conspiracy charges that could reach into the highest levels of territorial government. What do you need from us to proceed with federal investigations? Maya asked, understanding that they were at a crucial moment in their fight to protect the ranch. Continued documentation, witness testimony, and most importantly, your willingness to serve as federal witnesses in what could become a lengthy and potentially dangerous legal proceeding. Jake and Maya exchanged glances, both understanding the magnitude of what they were being asked to undertake. Fighting territorial corruption would require courage, persistence, and faith in the federal justice system's ability to protect honest citizens from local criminal conspiracies. Marshall Harrison, Jake said firmly, the Broken Arrow Ranch and everyone associated with it will provide whatever support you need to expose this conspiracy and protect honest ranchers throughout the territory. In that case, Marshall Harrison replied with satisfaction, I think we can promise that Victor Caldwell and his associates will soon discover that federal authority supersedes territorial corruption. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning when snow covered the Clearwater Valley like a pristine blanket, Maya Morrison stood at the window of the ranch house kitchen watching her husband supervise the final preparations for their Christmas celebration. The federal investigation had concluded with the arrest and conviction of 12 territorial officials, including Victor Caldwell, effectively ending the conspiracy that had threatened ranchers throughout the region. But the true victory wasn't measured in legal proceedings or criminal convictions. It was evident in the thriving ranch operations that continued under the joint management of Jake and Maya Morrison. In the confidence of ranch hands who knew their jobs were secure, and in the growing community of honest ranchers who'd learned to work together against threats to their shared way of life. Maya's hand rested on her swollen belly where their child moved with the vigorous energy of new life, eager to enter the world. Dr. Hayes had assured her that the birth would come smoothly, and she'd learned to trust his medical judgment completely during the months of preparation and careful monitoring. Mrs. Morrison, Frank called from the kitchen doorway, using her married name with obvious pleasure, Jake wants to know if you're ready for the Christmas visitors to start arriving. Maya smiled at the question, understanding that the celebration they'd planned would serve multiple purposes, honoring the season, celebrating their marriage and coming parenthood, and demonstrating the community's strength that had defeated the territorial conspiracy. Tell him I'm ready for anything, Mr. Murphy. This kitchen has handled larger challenges than Christmas dinner for 30 people. As guests began arriving from ranches throughout the territory, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate poverty to prosperous security, from isolation to beloved community membership, from the uncertainty of unwed motherhood to the joy of marriage with a man who valued her intelligence as much as her domestic capabilities. The pregnant woman who'd applied for washing clothes at the Broken Arrow Ranch had indeed received much more than employment. Jake Morrison had given her his name to wear, but more importantly, he'd given her partnership in building something lasting and meaningful in the Montana wilderness. When their daughter was born 3 weeks later, during a January blizzard that tested everyone's courage and endurance, Maya held the tiny girl in her arms and saw Jake's face transformed by wonder and fierce protective love. Margaret Morrison would grow up on the ranch that had become her parents' sanctuary, surrounded by people who understood that some victories were worth any sacrifice required to achieve them. Dr. Hayes, who'd attended the birth despite dangerous travel conditions, handed Jake the marriage certificate they'd requested him to witness. At the bottom, in Maya's careful handwriting, were the words that had become their family motto, built on love, sustained by partnership, protected by courage. The territorial conspiracy had been defeated through the combined efforts of honest people who refused to surrender what they'd built together. The Broken Arrow Ranch thrived under the joint leadership of partners who discovered that broken people could indeed fit together in ways that made them stronger than they'd ever been alone. And Maya Morrison, formerly Maya Thompson, late of Cleveland, Ohio, had found in the Montana wilderness everything she'd lost hope of finding: meaningful work, genuine love, protective community, and the kind of lasting security that came from being valued for exactly who she was. The pregnant woman who'd been given a paralyzed cowboy as a cruel joke had helped that cowboy become the hero of his own story. But more than that, she'd become the hero of her own story, proving that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting external enemies, but from having the courage to build something beautiful in harsh places where most people saw only obstacles and hardship. 20 years later, when the railroad finally reached Clearwater Valley, it passed through land that had been donated voluntarily by prosperous ranchers who'd learned to work with development rather than be destroyed by it. The Morrison family, now including 4 children and 2 grandchildren, remained the heart of a thriving agricultural community that balanced progress with preservation, growth with wisdom. Maya Morrison, now in her 50s, had become the unofficial historian of the territorial conspiracy trials. Her detailed documentation serving as the foundation for federal legislation that protected property rights throughout the expanding Western territories. But her greatest pride remained the family and community she'd helped build at the Broken Arrow Ranch, where love had triumphed over loss, partnership had overcome isolation, and courage had defeated the forces that preyed on honest people's dreams. The story of the pregnant woman who'd applied for washing clothes and received a rancher's name to wear had become local legend, told and retold around winter fires. As proof that sometimes broken things fit together in ways that made them stronger than they'd ever been whole. Part 5. Legacy of Love. 50 years after Maya Morrison first stepped off the Wells Fargo stage in Millbrook, she sat on the wraparound porch of the expanded Broken Arrow Ranch house, watching her great-grandchildren play in the same yard where she'd once hung laundry with trembling hands and uncertain hopes. The railroad had indeed come through Clearwater Valley, but instead of destroying the ranching community, it had connected them to markets and opportunities that made their agricultural paradise more prosperous than anyone had dared imagine. The territorial conspiracy trials had become the stuff of Montana legend, studied in law schools as an example of how federal oversight could protect citizens from local corruption. Maya's detailed documentation had been preserved in the territorial archives, a testament to the power of ordinary people armed with intelligence, courage, and determination to expose systematic injustice. But her true legacy lived in the 4 generations of Morrison family members who'd learned that love was the foundation of all lasting success. Margaret Morrison, now a successful attorney in Helena, had built her career on protecting property rights and fighting government overreach. Her brother Daniel managed the ranch operations with the same combination of practical wisdom and ethical integrity that had made their parents legendary throughout the territory. The youngest children, twins named Frank and Ruth after the Murphy couple who'd welcomed their mother with such generosity, were preparing to attend the state university, carrying forward the family tradition of combining education with agricultural stewardship. Jake Morrison, now 73, and still riding his beloved Thunder's descendants with the grace of a man born to the saddle, approached the porch with the slow smile that had captured Maya's heart all those decades ago. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined by years of Montana weather, but his eyes still held the warmth and strength that had made him a refuge for a desperate pregnant woman seeking nothing more than honest work and basic dignity. "Maya, love," he said, settling into the rocking chair beside her with the careful movements of age and wisdom. "Dr. Hayes just left after checking on the new foal. Says it's going to be the finest horse we've ever bred. Maybe we should name it after that ornery territorial commissioner who tried to steal our land. Seems fitting that something so beautiful should carry the name of something so ugly, just to prove that good always triumphs in the end." Maya laughed at her husband's gentle humor, understanding that even after 50 years of marriage, he could still surprise her with his ability to find joy and meaning in the simplest moments. Their love had weathered seasons of challenge and prosperity, grief and celebration, always returning to the fundamental truth that had saved them both. Broken people could indeed fit together in ways that made them stronger than they'd ever been whole. The pregnant woman who'd applied for washing clothes had received far more than Jake Morrison's name to wear. She'd been given partnership in building a legacy that would endure for generations, proving that sometimes the most important battles were won not with violence and force, but with love, intelligence, and the quiet courage to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.